there's a lot of information, a lot of talk about immigration, and not all of it is right, and not all of it is fact-based. So immigration is viewed by a lot as we're in a situation where immigration is at an all-time high. Well, yes and no is the answer there. It depends on how you measure it. The U.S., there's certainly, we think of ourselves as a nation of immigrants, but historically, we haven't been particularly welcoming to immigrants, at least not when they come. We welcome them after they've been here a while. And so, you know, people who talk about what their grandparents did and why aren't today's immigrants doing it, they weren't there when their grandparents were here. But today isn't that different in a lot of ways. The immigrants of today are much like the immigrants of the past. There are a lot of indications that today's immigrants are integrating or becoming Americans in much the same way that the immigrants in the past did. But we've experienced a lot of change from a generational perspective. In the space of a generation or two, the country has changed dramatically over what it was. But it's worth keeping in mind that what people view as the historical norms were not necessarily the historical norms. The 1950s and 1960s, which a lot of people look back at with nostalgia, were in fact, from a demographic perspective, from an immigration perspective, very atypical of the experience of the country. And I hope I can show you some of that. So I'm going to talk about how many immigrants we've gotten, where they come from, some of what our policies are, and what today's immigrants are like. And if I get to it, which I may not, talk a little about political representation, in particular the 2020 census that's coming up. But I will point out that you have one of the foremost, or not the foremost expert on the politics of the census right over here, Terry Ann Lowenthal, who I've known for quite a while and worked with at home. We've had a lot of big changes. Unauthorized immigration has basically stopped. The unauthorized immigrant population has started shrinking. There are more people moving to Mexico from the United States, more Mexicans moving to Mexico from the United States than Mexicans moving into the U.S. We don't know if there's been a fundamental change, but the scholars who work on Mexican migration have viewed us as reaching the end of the great wave of Mexican migration. The total immigration population is large. It's still growing, but it's growing much more slowly than it had been. A lot of that's due to the drop in the unauthorized population. And there's been a shift that more immigrants are now coming from Asia than from Latin America. And that was not true a decade ago. The unauthorized population is basically families with children. You really wouldn't know that from listening to a lot of the political rhetoric about unauthorized immigration, but about half of the adults are parents, and they're parents of U.S. citizens, kids who were born here. Immigrants are very important in the labor market, both at the high end of the highly educated part of the labor market and the less skilled part of the labor market, where they're overrepresented at both the upper part and the lower part. This is decade by decade. Starting in the 1820s, we got about 100,000 immigrants. In the 1830s, about 600,000. The numbers really started going up in the 1840s and 50s. So there's going to be a bunch of charts like this. This is decades worth of immigration. It went down a little in the Civil War, and then it picked back up again after the Civil War. Almost all of these immigrants were from Europe. That's the bottom part. There's a very small section from other places. But large numbers really started to come in the 1840s, particularly the end of the 1840s. But most of them were Irish and German Catholics coming into a Protestant country. So you started to see things like this, and pretty much everyone's heard it. This is an example of an ad from the New York Times for a girl wanted, but no Irish need apply. So they were willing to employ people, but not Irish. This is the flag of the Know Nothing Party, which was a very strongly nativist, anti-Catholic party that had quite a bit of political power in the 1850s. They ended up being in charge of the construction of the Washington Monument, which I just learned. There are commemorative stones that were sent from every state and other countries. Some mysteriously, the stone sent by the Vatican was lost. They sent a replacement in the 1990s. So, and this sort of anti-immigrant fervor goes way back. This is a quote about how immigrants are generally ignorant, and the Germans moving to Pennsylvania will never be able to become Americans. Ben Franklin. And this talks about the influx of foreigners who produce a mixed society, and they complicate things, and they bring foreign propensities and Hamilton. So, you know, this has a long history in the United States. You could rewrite these in sort of modern language, and they wouldn't be out of place in some parts, some of the discussions going on. After the Civil War, the numbers really started going up. 5.2 million in the 1880s. There were a lot of what were called panics, which were serious recessions in the 1890s, so a lot of immigrants didn't come at that point. And then the 1900s saw 9 million immigrants come in the first decade of the century, and that's when 3 of my 4 grandparents came. The fourth one came a few years before. The numbers went down in the 1910s, but that's largely at the end of the decade. Due to World War I. From 1905 to 1914, more than 1 million immigrants arrived in the United States every year. The country was about 75 or 80 million people then. So they were getting almost as many immigrants in a year then as we're getting now, coming into a country of 325 million people. So it had a much bigger impact then. Over this period from the 1880s and onward, we started getting a little bit of Asian immigration, and this is when the Eastern Europeans, the Poles, the Southern Europeans, the Italians, the Jews started to come in very large numbers. And this was not well received. So the first groups to feel the restrictionist sentiment were the Asians. So in 1882, we passed the Chinese Exclusion Act to keep Chinese laborers out of California. And you can see some very graphic anti-immigrant fervor in this. In 1907, we reached an agreement with Japan to curtail immigration to the US and stop the Japanese from coming. And then in 1917, we passed an act that was mainly directed at keeping the rest of Asia from immigrating, and this was a very broad definition of Asia. It went from the Arabian Peninsula over to the parts that we already banned. The only people who could come were Filipinos, and the Philippines had been a territory, a possession of the United States at that point. It also, interestingly, introduced a literacy test for European immigrants, but a literacy test in their own language, and it was pretty rudimentary. But there was a strong reaction to the Jews, the Poles, the Italians. The Binet IQ tests were developed around this time, and various measures were developed to assess the intelligence of the immigrants who came. One of the things they were given at Ellis Island was a puzzle to put together. And I looked at this, and I'm not sure I would know what to do with that. It's supposed to look like this. I don't think many immigrants were kept out by these intelligence tests, but the fact that they gave them at all is a bit disconcerting. In 1911, there was a group called the Dillingham Commission that was put together to study immigration. They concluded that Southern and Eastern European migration threatens American society and culture, that these immigrants wouldn't be able to become Americans. These, of course, were my grandparents, and I think a lot of you have ancestors who came about that time. They didn't recommend very many things, but they recommended reducing immigration and imposing this literacy test. It was really in the 20s when the restrictionists gained a lot of power. Some of this also, you have to keep in mind, was a reaction to the Bolshevik Revolution and some terrorist activities in the United States that were going on. But the 1920 Emergency Quota Act set the first numerical limits on immigration to the United States. And they limited it on a country-by-country basis to 3% of the immigrant population from that country that was in the United States in 1910. Now, this didn't do what the people wanted it to do, because 1910 was after the large scale, or in the middle of the large scale immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. So there were a lot of those folks in the 1910 population. So they came back in 1924, lowered it to 2%, and moved the date back to 1890, which essentially was before the Italian, the Polish, the Jewish immigration. So Italy's quota dropped to 4,000 per year, and for about a decade and a half, we had been getting 200,000 Italians every year. And there were similar impacts on Poles and Russians and Austrians and a lot of the countries that my ancestors came from. So immigration fell dramatically. For the second half of the decade, it dropped to 300,000 per year. It had been almost twice that after World War I. And for the decade of 1905 to 1914, it had been 1 million a year. So it cut immigration to a third of what it had been. And it shows up here, this drop to 4.1 million was from the restrictions that were imposed. But then came the Depression, and nobody wanted to come. There weren't any jobs. Unemployment was 25% sometimes. We got 500,000 immigrants in the decade of the 30s. We get that many now in about 5 months. But the restrictions were still there, so there were a lot of people by the end of the decade who were trying to get out of Eastern and Central Europe and were unable to because the quotas were in place and people couldn't get into the United States. During World War II, of course, we didn't get many immigrants. There was a lot going on, so we got about 1 million in that decade. After World War II, immigration started to pick up. 2.5 million in the 50s, more in the 60s. We still had in place these geographic quotas, which were very discriminatory. We basically didn't allow immigration from Asia. We let very few people in from some parts of Europe. Really, as part of the civil rights movement, there was a move to overturn these discriminatory quotas, which had been reinforced in 1952. They went back to 24, but in 1952 they had been reinforced. So the 1965 Immigration Act basically repealed these quotas, put every country on a more or less equal basis, and allowed immigration from Asia for the first time in basically this century. In 1976, we started applying this to the Western Hemisphere as well. There was a period here from 1965 to 1990 where immigration was completely overhauled. This is when I started working on it. It was a matter of great study. There were commissions that were looking at alternatives, looking at what was wrong with it. It's the way we used to do legislation. We used to study things. In 1980, we overhauled our refugee system, brought it in line with international standards of what a refugee is, and we set aside admission of refugees outside of the quota system so that we could admit people as needed. The Immigration Reform and Control Act in 1986, basically it legalized about 2.6 million formerly unauthorized immigrants, most of whom had been in the United States for 5 years or longer. It also, for the first time, made it illegal to hire someone who wasn't authorized to work. Before that, there were no sanctions against employers. And then the Immigration Act of 1990 really modernized the system. It increased immigration levels. It introduced employment-based immigration categories and created this diversity category to try and broaden the stream of immigrants that was coming, to open it up to people from countries where people didn't have relatives here. Now, the motives behind this weren't always pristine. The idea behind this for a lot of the people who crafted it and opened it up was to get more Europeans to come to the United States, because the European migrations had been so long ago that a lot of the Europeans didn't have immediate relatives in the United States. Ted Kennedy wanted to get more Irish admitted, and the diversity category allowed for 40,000 people from underrepresented countries. For the first 3 years, 40% of those were set aside for Irish immigrants, supposedly to deal with the hundreds of thousands of illegal Irish in Massachusetts. It turns out that was one of the myths, that there weren't that many people, and they never came close to filling the categories for Irish. It turned out there weren't that many Irish illegally here, and there weren't that many who wanted to come. So the diversity quotas the diversity category has mostly led to admission of African and Asian immigrants, which was really not what the people had anticipated. And so what happened after 65 is legal immigration started to go up. By the 1990s, we were admitting about 800,000 per year, 8.2 million. And you can see the dark bar there is immigrants from places other than Europe and Canada. So we started getting most of our immigrants from other parts of the world. Now, at the same time, we started getting illegal immigrants in very large numbers. So in the decade of the 90s, we had about 16 million immigrants come to the United States. And you can see here about half of them were unauthorized immigrants. In the 1996 and after, there were a bunch of laws passed to deal with this. They're not that interesting, and they didn't do that much, to tell you the truth. Currently, with the new legislation and the new categories of immigrants, we're getting about 1.1 million legal immigrants every year. So we've gotten around 11 million in the decade, the first decade of the 21st century, and my projection is we'll get about that many in this decade as well. We continue to get unauthorized immigrants, but the numbers coming started to drop dramatically. And you can see that for this decade, the unauthorized flow is not very big in terms of what we've gotten over the previous 4 decades. So to some extent, the illegal immigration problem seems, from my perspective, to have been resolved to a great degree. So is immigration higher than it's ever been? Well, numerically, yes, we're getting very large numbers, but another way to look at it, these numbers are the rate of immigration. This takes a decade's worth of immigration and relates it to the size of the population. Back here, we were getting, basically we're getting about 1% of the country's population every year in immigration is what these numbers mean. And the highest ones you can see are back in the 19th and early 20th century. Today, the numbers have dropped a lot. If you look at the average across this whole period, the average is about 5, a little over 5. So, is this the historic norm? Well, I don't know. I don't know what's normal. You can see it's gone up and down. It's gone up and down a lot. But right now, the numbers of immigrants we're getting are kind of right in line with what we've gotten across a long scope of our history. Now, it's still possible that's too many for some people. It's possible it's not enough for other purposes. But it's certainly not atypical. So this just takes these 3 great waves and just puts some faces and numbers on it. So the Northern European wave was really from the 1840s to the 1890. We got about 14 million immigrants over that period and into a much smaller country. They were almost all European, and they weren't always from the right parts of Europe at the time, but it became the right parts of Europe later. The Southern and Eastern European was a shorter period, about 30 years. We got about 18 million then, again, almost all European, but clearly at the time it was from the wrong part of Europe. Today, this newest wave, we've estimated that over 60 million now have come. And you can see very few are European. They're mostly Latin American and Asian. So who do we admit and why? Okay. A lot of the discussion of immigration is in terms of the economic contributions that immigrants can make to the country. We want to admit people who will help us, help our economy grow, and that seems to be the primary focus of the discussion a lot of times. Well, it turns out that only about 12 to 14% of the immigrants we admitted are admitted on the basis of economic considerations. And even then, only about half of them, or less than half, are the workers themselves. The rest of them are their families. So when we talk about skilled immigration or employment-based immigration, we admit about 140,000 people under employment categories, but only about 50 to 60,000 are the immigrant workers. The rest are their spouses and children. The main driver of our immigration policy is family unification. 2/3 of the immigrants we admit are close relatives of people who are in the United States. Most of them, it's about half close relatives of citizens and close relatives of immigrants who are not citizens. Almost all are spouses and children of these immigrants. So if we want to cut family immigration a lot, we're going to have to tell people, no, your wife can't come or your kids can't come. Now, we do admit adult children. We admit brothers and sisters. We admit parents, but those are the smallest categories within this. They're probably, I think they add up to about 15% of this 68%. And by the way, this is what's called chain migration in the discussion. So my grandfather, my mother's father, was the first one in his family to come. He brought his 3 brothers, he brought his sister, he brought his mother. That's chain migration. The moral basis for immigration is basically our refugee and asylum policies. About 15% of immigrants who are admitted through our refugee system or are given asylum. This is at the crux of a lot of the discussions going on about the Central Americans. And I don't know what the answer is, but most of the Central Americans who are trying to get into the U.S. at this point are fleeing, appear to be fleeing violence of different kinds and are trying to get asylum. The cultural part of it is this diversity. About 4% of the immigrants we admit are for this diversity category. These people have to meet certain criteria to be admitted. They're not nominated by their countries, which our president thinks they are. They apply through a lottery, but they have to meet certain minimum education and other criteria. And then there's a few admitted for a variety of things under the idea of sovereignty, security, and the rule of law. This is legal immigration. The numbers don't go up and down very much. Since 2000, we've admitted basically 1 million to 1.1 million with a few exceptions. The exceptions mainly have to do with the nature of processing immigrants. So we introduced extra security checks after 9/11, and it took longer. So the numbers admitted right after that went down. And then the numbers went up to make up for the delays. And this is something that a lot of people haven't realized, is that beginning about a decade ago, we started getting more immigrants coming from Asia than from Latin America. Some of it's due to the drop in unauthorized immigration. Some of it's due to admission of larger numbers through both employment, family, and temporary categories for highly educated Asians. So what's happened to it? I'm a demographer, so I'll talk some about that. Population growth has been driven largely by immigrants and their descendants and will continue to do so. The share of the population that is foreign-born is approaching some of the highest levels in the country's history, but it hasn't gotten there yet. It's had a big impact on racial and ethnic composition as we've admitted Latinos and Asians, and we've defined a lot of these categories differently. Before 1978, people from India were considered white. After 1978, they're considered Asian. So the way these things get defined can change, and the way we deal with this in population projections has been heavily criticized by some of my demographic colleagues. These changes have been very rapid. People now look back at times when things were very different and remember that as normal. So this is just over half of the growth we've experienced since 1965 has come from immigrants who came after 1965 and the children they've had. It's changed the composition. We basically have been a white and black country. These are, what is this, 1900, 1950, 1960. By 2000, we had 12% black, but we had 10% Latino. This is, yeah, and a little growth in Asians, but that's changed even more. So about 18% of the population is Hispanic origin now, and about 6% Asian. So this is very different from what a lot of people my age and a bit younger remember when we were growing up. There weren't a lot of Latinos. I grew up in Texas, and there weren't a lot of Latinos in Texas. So it's a different country. This is the foreign-born population, how many immigrants were living in the United States. It peaked around 14 million in 1930, but it started dropping. If you remember the chart about who was coming in, that's when the inflows were going down. In the US, we consider the immigrants to be people who were born outside the country. The children they have after they're here are Americans, they're natives, they're citizens. That's not the case in a lot of European countries or in most countries around the world. So if you talk about immigrant populations in a place like Germany, it includes a lot of people who were born in Germany because their parents were immigrants. So this is just the foreign-born population. And those numbers have gone up rapidly. Remember the charts about how many people were coming in. So we've hit about 45 million. This looks at the percent of the population that's foreign-born. So how common are the immigrants in the population? We're right at around 13% now. That's basically what the number was from about 1870 to 1930. So it's certainly not atypical. However, 1970, 1965, 1970, less than 5% of the population was foreign-born. That's what a lot of people remember. And not only that, those immigrants in 1965 were basically old white people who had immigrated at the beginning of the century. So we have a very, very different population in terms of the native foreign-born makeup. How's that likely to change? Given the demography of the country, we have a growing elderly population as us baby boomers age. More and more of the country is going to be 65 or older. More and more of the country is too old to have kids. So not only is our fertility rate, the rate at which women are having children, not very high, a small segment of the population is in those age groups to have children. So we're not going to grow from births. We're going to grow from immigration. We're going to shrink as people die, and more of us are getting into those age groups. So if the country is going to grow over the next 50 years, it's going to come from immigrants who aren't here yet. And I'll come back to that. The percent foreign born is going to keep going up. It may not go up this fast. I was a bit, when I did these projections, I thought our immigration system would function differently than it's likely to be functioning. But the numbers will continue to grow and the share will continue to grow. And that's because of age structure and fertility as much as anything else. This is what demographers call the immigrant stock. This is the immigrants and the children they've had in the US. So it's what we call the first generation, the immigrants, and the second generation are the children they've had here. Back in 1900, that was around 35%. We're heading back towards that, but we're at about 26%. About a quarter of the US population now consists of immigrants and their US born children. Again, 1970 was a low for this. So, you know, what is the historic norm here is subject to some interpretation. Unauthorized immigration, I'll try and go through this fairly quickly, but the numbers did grow very, very rapidly, but we've seen dramatic changes. The Mexican numbers, unauthorized Mexican population in the US has been shrinking for a decade, and it continues to get smaller. The southern border, in my interpretation, is basically secure. We've put fencing over most of the places where people can walk across. We've tripled the size of the Border Patrol from an already high level in the mid-2000s. The technology has improved dramatically, so they have sensors and drones where they can spot people coming in. It's very hard to sneak in. And even with that, where we're catching a much higher percentage of the people who are trying to get in, the apprehensions are the lowest they've been since the late 1960s. And I'll show you some data, but basically, to the extent we're getting new unauthorized immigrants now, a majority, maybe as much as 60%, are coming from people who arrive on legal visas and then just stay. So that's the system that's not working, is our system for keeping track of our legal temporary visitors. So this is the unauthorized immigrant population. 1990 to 2007, it grew by 500,000 a year on average. It went from 3.5 to 12 million, and it went rapidly up. And if it's growing by 500,000 a year, it probably meant that about 800,000 new people were coming every year, because we know a lot of them, there's a lot of churn in this. And then 2007 was the onset of the Great Recession. The numbers dropped. And for the numbers to drop, it means more people have to leave than come in. So we were losing unauthorized immigrants at the same rate that we had been gaining them. So it dropped by about 500,000 a year. Since then, it's kind of drifted down a little bit. The last data we have good data for is 2015. The 16-17 numbers suggest that it's level as well, but it's very broad margins of error, so we can't say much definitive yet. Mexico's the same story. The Mexico numbers went up by 5 million over this 17-year period, peaked at around almost 7 million, and then dropped. Those numbers have continued to go down. So the unauthorized Mexican population is shrinking and has been for a long time. The other countries, the numbers have been going up slowly, but they've been going up. So we're getting more unauthorized immigrants from Central America and from India and China. About a quarter of the US immigrants are unauthorized. It's not a majority, it's not even close. The biggest group are people who become US citizens. There's almost 20 million naturalized citizens in the U.S. And these numbers are growing. This is the one group here that's growing, as people who come with green cards after 5 years can become citizens, and a lot of them are doing so. The green cards, the lawful permanent residence, is about 12 million. It's been holding constant because as new people come in, but a lot become citizens. And then we get about 2 million. We have about 2 million people who are here on things like student visas, H-1B employment visas, a variety of temporary visas that allow them to stay in the country for, in many cases, 5 or 6 years on a temporary basis. Mexico is the largest group, but you can see Latin America, Central America is the second largest group, 1.6 million from Asia. But Latin Americans are about 3/4 of this, with and this is the biggest countries. El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras are the northern triangle of Central America. India, about 500,000 now from India. But remember, there's 5.5 million Mexicans. So there's 10 times as many Mexicans as these large countries. So, but the Mexico numbers are going down. So, Mexico is the largest source of legal immigrants as well. There's about 6.5 million Mexicans who are legal immigrants to the United States who are living here, almost 1/5 of all the immigrants. Asia is the second biggest group as a continental group, with about 1/3. Central South America and the Caribbean, about 1/4. The Middle East, North Africa is about 5%. This is apprehensions of Mexicans at the southern border. Actually, this is apprehensions of Mexicans anywhere, but almost all of it's at the southern border. In 2000, we caught 1.6 million people trying to sneak across the border. In 86, we caught 1.6 million. 2014, that was down to 229,000, which was the lowest it had been since 1971. Since then, the Mexico numbers have continued to drop. In fiscal 2017, we caught 130,000 Mexicans, which that we have to go back to 1968 to find as few as we caught. The non-Mexico numbers have gone up, but combined, they're nowhere near what they had been before. And again, most of these non-Mexicans are Central Americans, and most of them are actually not trying to sneak in. They're trying to turn themselves in. This is just the data I told you about. So in 2009 to 14, 1 million Mexicans and their children moved back to Mexico. Less than 900,000 Mexicans moved to the United States. So this is legal and unauthorized. But more people are moving to Mexico than from Mexico. This is the picture I told you. This is recently arrived unauthorized immigrants. 1/4 are from Mexico. 17% from Central America. Those are mostly people who tried to sneak across the border. Not all of them, but most of them, almost all of them. It's hard to walk here from Europe or from India. Some people do. Some people go from China to Mexico and try to sneak in, but there's not very many. Almost all of the unauthorized immigrants from Asia, from South America, from the Caribbean, from Europe, from Middle East, came to the U.S. with visas and overstayed. So you can see 60% of the unauthorized immigrants we're getting are people who come to the U.S. legally. So what happens with these immigrants? I'm going to try and go through this quickly because we got a little bit of a late start. and I don't want to keep you here all afternoon. Immigrants have an impact on the workforce. Most of the labor force growth we're going to get over the next 20 years is from immigrants who are yet to come. And the immigrants we're getting, unlike some of the stereotypes, we're getting a very high percentage of them are very highly educated. So this is just unauthorized immigrant men are much more likely to be in the labor force than legal immigrants and then natives. The unauthorized immigrants don't have many alternatives. If you're a US born, you can go to school. This is 18 to 64. You can go to school. You can collect disability. If you're towards the end of this age, upper end of this, you can retire. The unauthorized immigrants largely don't have that option. The pattern for women is reversed. Unauthorized immigrant women are less likely to be in the workforce. All of this difference and more is due to the share of immigrant women who are staying home with young children. Because they're more likely to have children. This is the one I want to get to. This looks at 2015 is the line, 2035 is the end of this. So it's a 20-year period. We're looking at working age people. We don't have to guess about fertility because these are people who are already born. So we can say with some certainty what the US born share of this is going to be. And you can see the bottom, the dark part at the bottom, the US born population of working age is going to shrink over the next 20 years. This is due to the large baby boom cohorts leaving working age populations, mostly retiring, but some of us are still working. The top part is the second generation. Those are US born children of immigrants. Those numbers are going to grow a bit because the children, the immigrants here now had 25, 30, 40 years ago are going to be entering the working age population. The gray piece in the middle is immigrants. Almost all of that is new immigrants who weren't in the US in 2015. So if this working age population is going to grow, it's going to grow because of the immigrants. So if we didn't get any immigrants over the next 20 years, the working age population would shrink. And it would shrink by 6 or 7 million. It's not going to grow very much regardless. So this is, in my mind, an important piece. Well, the economists will tell you there's two things to economic growth. You grow the population that's working, you grow the productivity. So if we're going to shrink the working age population, it puts that much more pressure on productivity growth to get the economic growth we're talking about. This is the new immigrants, people who've been in the US for less than 5 years. And you can see in 1970, half the new immigrants hadn't graduated from high school. And only about 8% plus 20%, 8% plus 12% or 20% had college degrees or higher. By 2000, that had changed. 35% were now less than high school, but we're up to 32% with college degrees. Recently, those numbers have continued to improve. So 45% of the new immigrants we're getting have college degrees or graduate degrees. So we're getting a very highly skilled immigrant flow at this point. Interestingly, the percentage of recent immigrants who haven't graduated from high school at 20% is still quite a bit higher than in the US-born population. So we're getting a disproportionate number at the low end of the education, but even with that, the share coming in at the high end is much, much greater than the native-born population of this is ages 25 and over. So we are getting a complementary flow of immigrants, if you will. They're adding to the highly skilled, and they're adding at the low end where there are a lot of occupations where they're needed. A couple of highlights here. I think a lot of this is misunderstood. This looks at immigrant families. 18% of households headed by natives include a couple and children under 18. 44% of unauthorized immigrants live in households headed by a couple with young children. Now, some of this is age. In other words, my household used to be a couple with young children, but my son is in his 30s, so I'm no longer in that group. But notwithstanding that, we're looking at basically young families here. This looks at all the households, all the people in unauthorized immigrant households. There's a little over 10 million adults, roughly 55-45 men versus women. There aren't a lot of unauthorized immigrant children. There's about 770,000. This number has been shrinking because the only way you can be an unauthorized immigrant child is for your parents to bring you. And we're not getting very many new unauthorized immigrants. So the number of unauthorized immigrant children has been cut in half over the last 15 years. But there's almost 5 million people who are US born with unauthorized immigrant parents. And then there's another million or so people who are older than 18. Some of them are also children of unauthorized immigrants. I want to hit a couple of points here in closing, and I'll do this quickly. 2/3 of the unauthorized immigrant adults have been in the US for 10 years or more. Over half of the unauthorized Mexicans came in the 20th century, not the 21st century. So we're talking about a population that's been here quite a while at this point. Real quickly, I want to cover the 2020 census. There's a move to add a question on citizenship to the collection in the census. There's a lot of concerns, and here's where Terry Ann is the expert. This will produce block-level statistics on the number of non-citizens, which I find actually frightening to have these numbers out there to say in this block there's this many non-citizens. And this many non-citizens who are Latino, and this many who are Asian, and this many who are Black, and this many who are white. The rationale is enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. The idea that this administration is interested in enforcing the Voting Rights Act is something I find a little hard to understand, but we've been enforcing the Voting Rights Act for 50 years without these data. And we have a lot of data on where non-citizens live. We can get it in larger areas, but not at block level. And in fact, that's the data I've been using to get this, is the data we get a lot of this. We collected this in censuses up through 1950 from everybody. We stopped doing that because they changed the way the census was done. We didn't stop it for any political or other reasons. We just stopped collecting quite as much information from everybody because techniques of statistical sampling had been developed, which permitted that, and we relied on the individuals to fill in the forms rather than the enumerator. So there's a lot of concern about confidentiality at an individual and group level. There's a lot of concern that we'll get lesser data, the data won't be as good. There are people who are proposing to use the data for apportionment of Congress. I don't think that'll pass constitutional muster. It hasn't so far. But I think it is conceivable that we could be drawing maybe congressional districts, but certainly state legislative districts and others on the basis of citizens. And whether that's a good idea or not is a subject of some debate. Just want to show you quickly, very quickly, what's going to happen. This is simple projections of congressional apportionment. We have data through 2017. I just kind of scooched them up a couple of years. So Texas is poised to gain 3 seats, Florida 3, North Carolina 1, and you can see the states in the Northeast and upper Midwest are poised to lose a seat each, and Alabama just sort of fluky based on its population size. If we apportion based on citizens only, Texas would gain 1 seat, but California would lose 3. And you can see it's a different group of changes that would happen if we use citizens as a basis for apportionment. And this is the projected apportionment compared to what if we use citizens. And you can see Texas would get 2 fewer seats. Florida would get 1. Arizona would get 1. This doesn't line up with the way the attorney generals are challenging this. So Texas would not gain as much if we use citizens. If we used unauthorized, if we took out legal unauthorized immigrants, which is harder to do, then you can see the impacts would be very different. It would affect California, Arizona, Texas, Florida, and New York compared to what they have now. I want to thank you for your attention.